Hello everybody and welcome to today's video on the Seni Seneviratne poem A Wider View. Now I was fortunate enough to interview Seni, so that interview has helped me form this analysis. I'll link the interview in the description, where you'll also find a link to a free worksheet which I've made to accompany this video. Seni Seneviratne is a poet, singer, writer and performer from Leeds, which is where this poem is set. Her heritage, and heritage is one of the key words in this poetry cluster, is both English and Sri Lankan. The poem A Wider View is taken from Seni's debut collection Wild Cinnamon and Winter Skin, which was published in 2007. Okay, before we get into a reading of the poem, let me explain some of the locations mentioned. This poem's set in Leeds, and if you don't know anything about the city, which I didn't before I started looking into it, then there's a fair bit to explain. Firstly, Marshall's Temple Mill is a reference to Temple Mill on Marshall Street in Leeds, which was a flax mill in the 19th century and was actually where Seni Seneviratne's great-great-granddad worked in real life. In a flax mill, workers turned plant fibre into linen. The work area was lit by 65 conical glass domes, hence the conicals of light referenced in the poem. Something we'll come to a bit later is how the building design was inspired by an ancient Egyptian temple. Tower Works is a former textile factory just down the road from Temple Mill next to the canal, which housed 3 chimneys. Now these chimneys were based on designs from Italy, one of which was Giotti's Campanile in Florence. Neville Street's Dark Arches refers to a location a little bit further on again, brick tunnels underneath the train station in Leeds, known locally as Dark Arches. The River Aire is the river which is located between Neville Street and Tower Works. The wharf is a riverside location next to the Dark Arches. So if you actually look at all of these locations on a map, you can see that chronologically they follow the walk the great-great-granddad is taking in the poem. Now we understand the locations, here's Seni reading the poem.
A wider view. From the backyard of his back-to-back, my great-great-granddad searched for spaces in the smoke-filled sky to stack his dreams, high enough above the cholera to keep them and his newborn safe from harm. In 1869, eyes dry with dust from 12 hours combing flax beneath the conicals of light in Marshall's Temple Mill, he took the long way home because he craved the comfort of a wider view. As he passed the panelled gates of Tower Works, the tall octagonal crown of Harding's chimney drew his sights beyond the limits of his working life, drowned the din of engines, looms and shuttles with imagined peals of ringing bells. Today, my footsteps echo in the sodium gloom of Neville Street's Dark Arches, and the red brick vaults begin to moan as time, collapsing in the River Aire, sweeps me out to meet him on the wharf. We stand now, timeless in the flux of time, anchored only by the axis of our gaze, a ventilation shaft with gilded tiles and Giotto's geometric lines, while the curve of past and future generations arcs between us.
And here's a simple translation of the poem. From the backyard of his cramped house, my great-great-granddad looked for room in the polluted sky to place his dreams out of reach of the cholera disease to keep them and his baby safe from harm. In 1869, his eyes dry with dust from working a 12-hour shift in a factory in Temple Mill flax mill, turning plant fibres into linen, he walked the long way home because he enjoyed the feeling of seeing something wider. As he passed the gates of the Tower Works factory, looking up at a tall chimney helped him see beyond his own limited life. The sound of imaginary bells drowned out the sound of the industrial world he was so used to. Today, my footsteps echo in the dimly lit arches, and the brick walls start to echo as if time itself pushes me out onto the river to meet my great-great-granddad. We stand now, unaffected by time, rooted together by our eyes being focused on a ventilation shaft designed just like the work of the Italian designer Giotto, while the link between the past and present generations of my family creates a bridge between us. If you're studying this poem in the AQA Worlds and Lives cluster, you might want to frame your focus around the way the world affects people's lives, and in that way we can say that a wider view shows the negative impact of the world around us. In terms of lives, we might look at how our lives are influenced by our past and our family heritage, which means it compares well with Liz Berry's homing. It's interesting because there are two distinct lives in the poem. There's the great-great-granddad who works in the flax mill in the 19th century and that world of the Industrial Revolution that he lives in, and there's the modern-day speaker who connects with him at the end of the poem. Let's start with the great-great-granddad. How does the world he lives in affect his life? Well, in simple terms, we can say negatively. In the opening stanza, the great-great-granddad stands in the backyard of his back-to-back house, and these houses were found in many industrial cities and were houses that were squashed together with shared back walls. What happened in Leeds, like many cities, was that it experienced rapid population growth during the Industrial Revolution, with many people moving to the cities from the countryside in search of jobs. Now, this led to overcrowding, sanitation problems and poor housing conditions, and you add to this the pollution of the factories themselves, and we start to see a very bleak image of the great-great-grandfather's world. He endures not only the cramped housing and pollution-filled skies, but also the threat of cholera. And all of this is historically accurate. Cholera was a big issue at this time in Leeds and other industrial cities because of the overcrowding and poor conditions. And in the midst of this, the great-great-granddad's looking up into the sky, searching for a space clear of pollution in which to stack his dreams. The suggestion is that in contrast to the harsh industrial life, he draws strength and inspiration from the natural world. AQA stated that the modern poems in this cluster are rooted in the revolutionary spirit of the Romantics, and one of the things about Romanticism, which I explored in my video on Wordsworth's Lines Written in Early Spring, is a dislike of the urban world and a love of nature, which is of course exactly what we see in this poem. We're reminded of the beauty and power of the natural world. This is also the first time we understand the title, symbolising how the great-great-granddad desires a wider view, a better life, than the one he's currently experiencing. In stanza 2, we get to see the daily life of work in the flax mill. After a 12-hour shift, eyes dry with dust, he takes the long way home. In stanza 3, he looks at Harding's chimney and imagines the sound of ringing bells, and this is a clever image because the tower that this one was based on in Italy did have bells in it, but of course the chimney in Leeds did not. And Seni explained this part of the poem in our interview.
When I discovered my great-great-grandfather in Temple Mill, which was where the flax was prepared, and I'd found out, I knew that he was somebody who combed flax, and I also knew from looking at pictures that the mill would have been very noisy. From looking at pictures, I knew that there would be very little light in there, because the light came down sort of through. It had a flat roof, a green roof, in fact. And a very interesting fact that I found out was that it had a green roof, and they used to graze sheep on it to keep the greenery down. But there were these like conical, basically these circular light windows that sent shafts of light. So when I thought about the noise in the place and the fact that there was very little light and the dust and getting in your eyes. So it all felt very enclosed and claustrophobic and, yeah, not a very pleasant place to work, and the hours that they used to work. So then when I imagined him walking home and passing those towers, I suppose the idea of him walking home was because, I mean, I know this. If I've been doing a lot of close work, then I want to go out and have a walk and look, have a wider view. I want to look to her across the horizon and rest my eyes from that close work. So I guess I was just imagining that that would be a reason for him to take that journey, really, and taking a long way home, because he wants the fresh. Well, he wants the air. It's not necessarily fresh in those days, but he wants the kind of the chance to look up, I guess, and have that wider view. And I realize that also has another significance, because it does have an echo of then a wider view in terms of, is there more than this to life? Yeah, I guess that comes into it, really. And so when I imagine him walking past there, and seeing a tower that might have had bells in it, I guess that's just expanding that view a little more. So, contrasting between the engines and the looms and the shuttles, something that is just so much lighter a sound, and so much more about, reaching, it's more up than down, really. It's more kind of reaching out to the sky.
So again we get a reference to the poem's title. The great-great-granddad is desperate for a better life, looking up into the sky. The world he lives in is so oppressive, he dreams of something better. This then brings us to stanza 4, to the today of the speaker walking through the same area. Now clearly the modern speaker would have a very different life. Just like the speaker in Homing who looks back to their loved one's industrial roots, the speaker in A Wider View would not be working in Temple Mill or Tower Works. This industrial way of life is now a thing of the past, but they are in the same locality, walking through Neville Street's dark arches. Something intriguing then is the question, has this person managed to achieve the wider view that the great-great-granddad desired? And the answer seems to be suggested by the way they're walking in the sodium gloom. Now on a simple literal level, this is a description of the sodium vapour lamps that are found on streetlights which give out a yellow light. But on a symbolic level, there are two things to consider. Firstly, the obvious negative connotations of the word gloom, which can mean poorly lit, but also depressed or sad. Second, the word sodium, which works in a similar way. A sodium light is artificial, and there's an obvious parallel between the sodium gloom of this stanza and the smoke-filled sky of the first. If we read sodium gloom as a reference to the artificial lighting of street lamps that we find in cities, we can see it as symbolising how the speaker still doesn't have that connection to nature or the wider view the great-great-granddad craved. Times have changed, but the speaker perhaps still feels trapped or confined in their life. In the final stanza, the speaker meets their great-great-granddad on the wharf, and they both look up at Harding's chimney. Looking up is a recurring image in this poem, and if we link it to the title, it's as if the great-great-granddad is encouraging the speaker to take a wider view, to look beyond their current life and to dream of something better. It's interesting how the two people are anchored together in this experience. There's a sense of belonging and connection between the two generations brought about by looking up. And what are they looking up at and beyond? Harding's chimney with Giotto's geometric lines. Harding's chimney was a part of a factory, but was made to look like the bell tower of Florence Cathedral in Italy, designed by Giotto, and that's important. When I asked Seni what the poem tells us about belonging, she explained,
it probably tells you something about my feelings about the whole issue of belonging. Growing up in Leeds in the 1950s in a mixed heritage family, the question of belonging was very present, really. Like where do we belong? We belonged very, very, very much in my mum's extended family. We were very, to me, it feels like a big contrast in a way to a lot of the narrative that's happening at the moment about migrants and refugees. My father was welcomed into their family. They were a kind of welcome all comers kind of family, my auntie used to say it was like our house had rubber walls because anybody who was around was welcomed in, and there was always food for anybody who arrived. And in that spirit, my dad was very much welcomed as part of the family. And even though some people were critical, you know, people knocking on my grandmother's door and saying, I've seen your daughter in town with a black man, she would just say, yes, I know, and he's in my front room now having a cup of tea, you know, what's your problem, sort of thing. So she was very fortunate to have parents like that. And then I was fortunate to be a child in that family, because for me, growing up, that family, I suppose, sheltered us from the kind of prejudice that might have been around, that grew as well over the years, I would imagine, you know, in terms of what was happening in the country. So belonging became more of so there I was in that family, rooted in that family in some way, but there was always this other family that was in Ceylon, as it was then called, and then Sri Lanka, which was a sort of a very romantic thing for me. It was very much a heart place for me. Pictures and letters from over there, and tea sent over there from relatives over there. So even though I've never lived there, I sort of feel like I belong there a little as well. And then as you're growing up, you realise that there are places where you belong and then you don't belong, or you might belong because you've got the right accent. Like if I speak with a Yorkshire accent, it makes me belong in Yorkshire, but when people see me, it makes them think I don't belong. So there's that sort of dilemma all the time, really, about you just feel like you're a person fitting in with things, and then you realise that other people are seeing you in a different way. So for me, that's what belonging is all about. It's kind of, it's a very mixed bag. I can't say when I'm in this place I feel really at home. Yeah. I don't often say that, and some people I know do that. You know, when I go back to the place I was born, I feel at home, and I think for me, home is more disparate, really. I think, and it's not just in the present. So that connection with the past is very important. That connection with why our families came together, and then the questions and the stories about the past of both families is part of who I am now, really. And I feel like I carry that with me all the time. So that was the sense of poem, I guess, of this past and the future, and all being there all at once. That, you know, they're always there.
So Seni is writing about how belonging and heritage are not just about one place, but about numerous places, and this ties in with the settings in the poem. Temple Mill was a factory in Leeds, but was designed to look like an Egyptian temple, as you can see here. Harding's chimney was part of another factory, but was made to look like the bell tower of Florence Cathedral in Italy, seen here. So Temple Mill and Harding's chimney are both symbols in the poem. These buildings merge different cultures and time periods, and that reflects how Seni's sense of belonging incorporates different cultural and historic influences. In terms of worlds and lives, perhaps we can interpret then the wider view of the title as the acknowledgement of the fact that our lives are made up of diverse cultures, histories and influences. Our lives are influenced not just by one singular time or place, but many, and this gives us, the reader, a chance to think more widely ourselves, to consider what belonging could mean for each of us. If you found this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.